I've used two different theme titles for the journey that we're on together in this letter at the back of this collection of books we call the Bible. The first title we used was Stuck in the Middle with You. Now that's not just a great song, but it's a feeling that many of us have been sharing for months now about being stuck in a crisis, stuck in chaos, stuck in a pandemic, stuck in lockdown, stuck in our lives. The next title we moved on to has been Signed, Sealed, Delivered, I'm Yours. Another great song lyric. This time there's a nod in there to the fact that this piece of writing and this little letter at the back of our Bible is a letter, so it's designed to be signed by the author, sealed up and delivered to groups of people in Asia Minor, actually, in the 1st century. But it's not just any letter. This is a letter full of signs. Signed, sealed, delivered. And the signs include wild things to us like trumpets, bowls, angels, and in fact seals themselves, the wax seals. But there's more going on in here, because as this letter was taken round, it was to be read out loud to groups of people who were desperate for hope or comfort or challenge. And so it's full of other messages about a different kind of being delivered. The kind of being delivered that means being rescued. So there's been, lots of themes all mixed together, but two that we've kind of drawn out have been, first, that things may seem stuck, this message is saying, but there's more going on than you realise. And if you are in the middle, you're not in the middle alone. With you. The with you being their God, the living God. So this letter is written by a man called John, and it seems at first glance, as you start to work your way through it, to be a bit of a mess. I mean, there's a riot of signs, as we've said, and symbols and metaphors and pictures and images and ideas, and it doesn't come in a neat list or with bullet points or a logical argument. Instead, it feels like being part of a drama or art. It actually provokes emotions, feelings. And this mess of signs and symbols and ideas, they seem to jump all over the place. They're not in a neat line. But as I listen to it, as I feel how it makes me feel, I realise that, in fact, there's a huge amount of care and craft and inspiration in this glorious mess, designed to provoke our imaginations, to create feelings, to evoke comfort, to provoke challenge. It's not a story as such either. It's not a chapter by chapter story with events that happen one after the other. Instead, the writer John piles on various scenes and perspectives and visions and experiences, and they go backwards and forwards, and they repeat again, and they overlap, and they come from a different angle, and they hint and they suggest. And it feels like something that you're designed to experience. It doesn't actually feel like a puzzle that needs to be worked out in every detail. There are sort of two halves, if you like, to the letter called the Revelation. And chapter 12 is where things stop and start again in some ways. It's as if John zooms out and then he zooms back in. He takes his pad and he takes a brand new sheet of paper and he starts another angle. And his letter's called The Revelation for a reason, because for him it's about pulling back the curtain, about sharing an experience that reveals, that uncovers what is really going on, and why there is hope in the middle of this situation that they are in the 1st century and for us today. So as John comes at this again with a new experience, he describes in chapter 12 another set of signs. And the first sign is a woman with a crown of 12 stars crying out in pain. Now, there are people who love to pore over writings, letters like these in this collection, and then try and decode them, like it's some sort of prediction, secret code prediction of history and events that will happen, and try and match things up to particular places and people in history. And there's a huge amount of fun to be had in doing that. And there's lots of mainly fictional mileage to be had in that kind of pursuit. However, it's worth thinking again about John's first listeners, scattered throughout Asia Minor in the shadow of the Roman Empire in the 1st century, as they gather in these homes, desperate to be reminded why they're even part of this movement in the first place, and why the Roman Empire and its culture seems to be winning everywhere, drawing them away or beating them down, taking all their resources. They would have heard this set of signs and this particular sign, and they'd known straight away that a woman with a crown of 12 stars crying out is their story. It's the story of the people of Israel, the Jewish people, the Hebrews, known throughout their stories as the bride of God. And their God is the God of the 12 tribes of Israel, the God who heard their cry and repeatedly in their story hears their cry and rescues them from the slavery that has fallen on them at that particular time, famously at the root in Egypt. And so they're crying out again. And in their stories of hope, in their poems, in their prophets, their songs, there's talk of their nation giving birth to somebody who is going to help them be the people they were made to be. He's going to be part of the process of making them be who they were made to be. A prophet, a priest, a king, an anointed one, a Messiah, a Christ. And so a woman with a crown of 12 stars crying out is God's people hoping to birth a Messiah. But then John describes another sign. This time an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. Its tail sweeping some of the stars out of the sky. We're in absolutely perfect monster movie territory here. Dragons make great monsters. I can hear the dollar signs in people's minds as they think of the scenes they could make out of a huge blockbuster movie out of this. I see a fantasy movie script starting right here. A monster that can lay waste to even the stars in the sky. But while we think of blockbuster movies, what do John's listeners in the 1st century hear? Well, through their stories, through their childhoods, through their cultural memories, the image of the dragon, the monster, the snake, represents anything or anyone that opposes what their God is doing, that brings chaos. Their God brought order from the deep, from chaos. And that chaos is constantly trying to pull things apart. And that's the story of their history, and it's the story of their roots and their poems and in those songs of Genesis right at the start of their story. When things were at their darkest, at the moments when they felt furthest from who they were supposed to be, they would turn to prophets and books of hope, and particularly a book called Daniel, which again gives us big images of monsters, full of visions about someone who would among that come to put things to right, a Messiah. The image of the monster with 10 horns comes straight out of that. But that opposition takes lots of forms. Pharaoh was likened to a monster in Egypt. And then Babylon and Rome are again talked about as images of the opposition to God. And this dragon here has 7 heads. And John's listeners know that Rome is famously built on 7 hills. They wouldn't have to think hard to know what this reality is being talked about by John. This is a message of hope, remember. And notice that despite how scary this monster is, it can only have a limited effect. It's only some of the stars that are knocked down. And that image of stars is also used sometimes of the churches, the groups of Jesus followers that he's writing to. If there was any doubt about what these 2 signs are, there is a third character in the vision. The child. So in this terrifying scene, a monster waits at the birth of a child to devour the child. This is horrific. We can't look. We couldn't watch a movie like this. But John's listeners hear that this child is a son who will rule the nations with an iron rod. Again, ring, ring, ring. My Jewish memory bells are then ringing because this is a repeated image from my childhood, the 7 feasts we would have in the year, my poetry books, my songs that were sung in our tribe, reminding me who I am, who my God is, and what my God has done in our story. And someone who deals with the nations with a rod of iron comes from the Psalms, from Psalm 2 in particular, and reminds me that this rod is the rod of a shepherd, and used by the shepherd to protect the flock from predators. And the symbol of the great good shepherd, then used of Jesus, was originally used of our great King David, who the Messiah was due to come from. Sometimes people like to tell me that Revelation is a really difficult book. That's not what John wants. He wants to reveal things that he's been given, inspired, experienced. And what he's revealing here isn't anything new. It's not a surprise to his listeners. It's not anything that they don't already know. It's not already been revealed in Jesus of Nazareth or in these other 65 books in this collection. But what his listeners need is to be reminded, to feel it. And so this letter is drama, a deep, moving, inspiring assault on their senses that can't help them react, to feel comforted, reminded, inspired, challenged, to give them hope. The movement that they have given themselves to, the way of Jesus of Nazareth, began with a child who was seen as so dangerous that the ruler, Herod, wanted to kill him as a child. But Jesus of Nazareth was snatched away to Egypt to safety before the monster could devour him. Well, what a surprise! This, tucked away at the end of our scriptures, is a Christmas story. Forget having lobsters in your nativity play. Get yourself a dragon costume. This scene, these signs, is the story of God and his people, the people of Israel, the people of God, saved to be part of what God is doing to bring things back together, and from whom Israel was to come the Messiah. And he did. Jesus of Nazareth, whose life and death and resurrection dealt with all the barriers that get in the way of God's project getting back on track. And the pushback. This is the story of the pushback, the forces that constantly have tried to stop that and have tried but failed. And the project now moves forward. The story actually isn't even a cliffhanger. This would actually make a terrible movie, a terrible monster movie. Dragons might make great monsters, and the scale of this is wonderful, and there's a huge amount of horror in here, but a story that tells you on the first page that the lamb wins doesn't have any tension. It doesn't have any suspense. That would make a terrible movie. This is not that kind of story. The victory is already won. The child was born, lived, died, and was snatched up to be with God as a big yes to everything he did and said. The mission succeeded. The attack failed. In fact, it was his death at the hands of one version of the monster's hand that made all the difference. And this is not a fantasy story. This kind of scene reminds John listeners again that this letter is a reality story. That there is a reason why it feels like they're under attack, while it feels like chaos, while it feels like they're stuck, while it feels like they need delivered. And that's because despite the victory being won, the monster, even though it knows it is defeated, is still lashing out. And its target, all it has left, is God's people. The child snatched up in this story, but the woman, the people of Israel, the people of God, are left in the wilderness. And John's listeners know their story. That the wilderness is where they were rescued from, but then they wandered, learning how to be who God had made them to be, that they were partners in what God was doing. And there they were under attack, but only for a time. God's people are once again in the wilderness, in the in-between. And the monster, the enemy, the accuser, the empire, the chaos might be defeated, but is still lashing out, aiming to mess things up for as long as he can, to make God's people suffer to damage God's creation project while he can, because he knows there's a limit. A limit to what he can do and a limit to how long this will last, because we know this is not the end of the story.